Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to do a book review. This is the book, Scientific Advertising by Claude Hopkins. Now, if you don't know who Claude Hopkins is, basically he is one of the founding fathers of modern advertising. Maybe you've heard of David Ogilvy. Well, David Ogilvy basically learned from Claude Hopkins. So he was around in the early 1900s and he revolutionized advertising. He had a very scientific, rational approach to it, and he was very performance based. So before Claude Hopkins, people just sent out advertisements and hope it would work. But because of him, people actually started treating it more seriously and started thinking about strategy. Now, with all that said, you might still be wondering what's in it for me. Well, I'm going to dive into the details later on, but basically, here are the main takeaways. What struck me the most is that Claude Hopkins, he said, a man should take two things seriously in life: his family and his business. And he's right. Because what if you're just sending out advertisements out there, but you're not even sure if they're working? You're not tracking the results. You're not sure if they're getting clients and profits. I mean, what are you doing? Isn't it important to you that your business is generating profits and all the people that depend on it? Well, it should be. Also, something to keep in mind is this book is written in a very traditional classical style, so it's a little bit difficult to read, but the concepts that are in it and the insights that are in it, they are important and they will guide you to making better advertisements. Now, let's talk a bit about the details of the book. So he has a list of chapters. There's quite a few, but we can group them into several categories. So the first category is basically the principles of advertising. These are the first few chapters. He talks about how advertising laws are established, that advertisement is basically about salesmanship, that you need to offer service. And then he talks about something called mail order advertising. Now, what is that? Mail order advertising. Basically, it's an older way of advertising that was very prevalent in the late 1800s until about 1950, 1960, where then TV started taking over and eventually then digital marketing. But mail order advertising was very interesting because it was basically advertisement on print. This is basically sending letters directly to people's inboxes, so mailing them, and also just advertisements in newspapers and magazines. So these were very interesting because they taught us that you need to use the space very efficiently. Now, what was also interesting about mail order advertising back in the day is that it was a great way to track the return of the advertisements. Because the way this would work is people would often use coupons and things like that. So they would cut them out of the papers and go to the local store. And then basically people at the local store, they could count how much coupons they got and they would know how much returns they got from the advertising. Now, at the end of the book, there's a whole chapter that goes more in detail about how you need to deal with local stores and dealing advertisements to different towns and cities. But that's a little bit like old school. So we're not going to dive into detail of that, but we're going to dive into more of the insights into how we can actually write good copy and the principles of good advertisements. Now, a few more things that he talks about in the first chapter basically is that ads are just salesmanship. So with these ads, we should be very persuasive with our copy and our headlines and all the images that we use, because just like a salesman drives people to take immediate action in person, we also want to do this with our advertisements. So that's that, salesmanship. He talks about offering service. So it's very important that you solve a particular problem with the product and the service you're offering. And you also need to show that in your advertisements. You need to speak to what people want, their pain points, and how that's going to improve their life or specific aspects of their life at least, or make it more fun, more engaging, depending on what you're selling. So this is basically the first chapter. So in the chapters that come after that, he talks about headlines, basically why headlines are important. And that's something that really captures the attention of your audience and your potential customers. So put a lot of attention into your headline. Make sure it's clear, make sure it's precise, make sure it speaks to the customer. Then we dive into the psychology. So basically how you can persuade people and how you should be aware of how people think and what like their habits are, and how to get them out of their patterns and stuff like that. Then he talks about being specific. So being specific, basically this means don't, when you're presenting something, don't present it in general terms, but make it specific. So if you're solving a problem, be specific about what's problem you're solving. Be specific about how you're going to do that and how you're going to generate results so that people know actually, well, oh, that makes sense because he just explained exactly how he's going to help me. All right, well, then Claude Hopkins basically, after the specific, he goes into telling your full story. So, especially back in the day in mail order advertisements, but now actually in advertisements in general, it's important that you consider your advertisements from start to finish and think about, well, does this convey the entire message? Is the customer going to have any doubts or confusions after this? Because what you don't want to happen is that people read your advertisements and then they're like, maybe, well, actually, this is kind of interesting, but I'm not sure what to do. Like, where do I go now? Am I supposed to go to some shop? I don't know. I'm kind of confused. Well, it's important that you convey your entire message and you tell the customer not only how it's going to help him, but also where he needs to go and what he needs to do, maybe to claim the offer or to buy the service. So it's really important that all the information is included in the advertisements so that basically you can take the customer from point A to point B without any confusion. That's telling your full story. Now, there's also a chapter on art in advertising. So back in the day, he says that this was about 50-50. So in general, it varies, of course. But in general, in advertisements was about 50 the art, so pictures and stuff like that, and 50 the actual copy and text. When we're talking about the art, it's important that it doesn't just look good, but it also actually conveys the message that you're trying to tell. So it actually helps put your product in a better light, and maybe it conveys some of the pain points that your customer is struggling with, or maybe it just looked like something amazing that your product is featured in. But make sure you're clear and specific with your art and that it doesn't just look beautiful, but it's also useful. Then he talks about things too costly, which is basically, he says that it's very important to make sure that when you're using something, maybe you're sending out a letter to someone, track the expenses and make sure that it's actually getting you a good return, that you're actually profitable. Because if you're just using things but you're not sure of the costs, then you're not performance based anymore, and that's when it starts getting dangerous, because then you can make losses and stuff like that. So we should always be aware of the expenses that we're using in order to generate the best profit. So then he basically talks about information, which is gathering information for relevant data. So he talks about that there used to be an advertisement campaign that focused on a specific problem that they thought people were having, and they just sent out this advertisement everywhere. But what happened then is they actually did a customer survey. So they sent out letters, surveys to a lot of people, and they asked them like, hey, what is something that resonates you? What is something, the reason why you would buy a product like this? What is something you would like to improve? And then that way they gathered a lot of data from that. Then it actually cost them a lot of money to send out all these surveys and things like that, but they gathered a lot of information from that, and now they know what exactly their customer wants. So what happened then is they changed their entire advertisement campaign, and they made advertisements that were more targeted to the results of the survey. And also, obviously, this made them a lot more profit than when they were just doing things blindly. So it's very important to gather information and to know what your customer wants. He also talks about strategy. In strategy, he basically goes over that it's important to treat advertisements again seriously. He even says like as if it were a war. So we need to be very skillful in how we deal with things. Now, he basically goes over that your naming as a business and your product is important because you don't want it to look like a commodity. You want it to look like something unique. And he goes over a few more strategic details that you can read over. Then he talks about the use of samples, which is basically using sample advertisements to see if they get any results. And then he goes into the chapter that I mentioned earlier, which is basically about getting distributions in several towns and cities. Also sending out test campaigns. So sending out, again, campaigns to know, well, is this actually a good idea or should we change things up? So that's basically that. And then he has some more chapters on individuality, negative advertising, letter writing, and just good business principles. That's basically the entire book. It's pretty short, but I do think like it's interesting to see how they did things back in the day, and also like some of the insights that they have, they are very applicable to this day. Maybe the distribution is a little bit different now, but how to write good copy, how to write good advertisements, good headlines, how to like actually get insights on your customers, and knowing that that's important, that's all still very relevant today. Now, by the way, if you were wondering how an ad used to look like back in the day, basically there's an example here. So that's how an advertisement used to look like. And they had like lots of these like letters and things in newspaper. So that's one example. Now, as I said, this book is very useful. It's a little bit old school, but a lot of the insights are still useful today. If you like this book, also check out David Ogilvy. I'm probably going to do a review later on him as well. I still need to read that book, but it's pretty interesting. So if you found this book review helpful and perhaps you learned something, give this video a like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and it helps me cover more amazing topics like this. So let's all go and do some more scientific advertising.